This is episode 86 of the Equestrian Author Spotlight podcast. I'm Carly Cade, and today I'm speaking with James C. Nicholson. Jamie is the author of numerous books, including The Kentucky Derby, How the Run for the Roses Became America's Premier Sporting Event, Never Say Die, A Kentucky Colt, The Epsom Derby, and the Rise of the Modern Thoroughbred Industry, and The Notorious John Morrissey, How a Bare-Knuckle Brawler Became a Congressman and Founded Saratoga Racecourse. Jamie received a PhD and JD from the University of Kentucky, practices law, and teaches U.S. history in Lexington, Kentucky. Today, we're discussing his newest book, Racing for America, The Horse Race of the Century and the Redemption of a Sport. Now, let's get into the interview. Welcome to the Equestrian Author Spotlight podcast, a podcast featuring interviews with equestrian authors who love all things horses and writing about them. In each episode, you'll hear inspirational stories from horsebook authors, including writing advice and marketing tips to help you write your very own horsebook. If you're an author, aspire to be an author, or simply love horsebooks, then you are in the right place. I'm your host, Carly Cade, and creative writing makes my spurs jingle. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Equestrian Author Spotlight podcast. I'm Carly Cade, and today I'm speaking with James C. Nicholson. However, he likes to be called Jamie, so you'll hear me call him Jamie, and he's here with me today. So, hi, Jamie. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Carly. Thank you for having me.
Of course. I'm so excited to have you. And we're going to learn a lot from Jamie today because not only has he written a bunch of books about the thoroughbred industry, which we're excited to dive into, but he's also the editor of the Horses in History series through the University Press of Kentucky. Did I get that right?
Got it.
Awesome. So, Jamie, for people who listen to the show often, how I always love to start these conversations off is just to learn how your relationship with horses began. Because, and I also love that you're a gentleman coming on the show and you have involvement with horses because a lot of us these days are ladies. So I'd love to hear your history with horses and how you got interested in being around them.
I grew up on a thoroughbred farm in Lexington, Kentucky. It was my grandparents' farm and my family lived adjacent to it. And I had a friend whose grandfather and uncle trained American saddlebreds. I had a chance to ride them a little bit at their barn, but from the time I was very young, horses were kind of just around and part of the scenery. I started working on the farm as a teenager, summers, Saturdays, a little bit after school, mostly on the maintenance crew. I would help out preparing yearlings for the fall sales. And one summer in college, I worked as a groom for a thoroughbred trainer in Ireland. And since then, I've had a variety of jobs in and around the thoroughbred industry, including my current job in equine insurance. And my wife shows hunter jumpers, but an occasional trail ride is more my speed.
I hear you. So it's almost like you were born into it with the family farm, and then you married into it with a wife that loves to do hunter jumpers and you ride and all those things, and you grew up in Kentucky and there's horses everywhere. So it's like sort of natural that you would kind of progress into equine insurance and you write books about them. I mean, you received a PhD and a JD from the University of Kentucky. You practice law and you teach U.S. history in Lexington. And on top of all that, you are an author. I wanted to ask, why thoroughbred racing in particular? I mean, it seems to make sense. You grew up in the bluegrass country, but what inspired you to start writing about thoroughbreds? And the Kentucky Derby is of particular interest to you.
Well, in hindsight, it would seem like it all made sense and would have come naturally. It was more of an accident that I started writing about racing. It felt that way at the time. I was in my first year of graduate school at UK for history, and I needed a paper topic, and the professor told the class that you should probably pick a topic of local significance because they're easier to research, and he suggested, well, how about the UK basketball team, something about that. And I liked the sports angle, but I didn't like his specific suggestion. And so I decided to try to answer the question of why the Kentucky Derby became a big deal, both culturally and as a horse race. And that little paper eventually became my first book. I hadn't intended to write about racing. It just kind of happened, but I found myself returning to the subject largely because of what it can tell us about American society and culture. I'm
Hmm.
not aware of too many realms of American history that involve so many people from so many different kinds of backgrounds and that can tell us so much because of the sport of racing's long history dating back to the colonial era. You can really tell a lot about a particular time in American history by looking at horse racing.
Yeah, and that is incredibly fascinating. And you have really explored this in a variety of books. So we're going to talk about your newest book here in a second, but you are also the author of, these are long titles, bear with me here, but The Kentucky Derby: How the Run for the Roses Became America's Premier Sporting Event. The second is Never Say Die: A Kentucky Colt, the Epsom Derby, and the Rise of the Modern Thoroughbred Industry. And then the next is The Notorious John Morrissey: How a Bare-Knuckle Brawler Became a Congressman and Founded Saratoga Racecourse. I mean, there's some like really interesting history and stories inside of these books that you've written. Do you want to give us a little, highlight from each book so listeners can check those out too before we get into your newest?
Sure, yeah, they are long titles, but the first one, the Kentucky Derby book, I tried to explain how and why the race became an important piece of Americana. Conventional wisdom held that Colonel Matt Wynn, the longtime manager of Churchill Downs, was this master promoter, and he kind of willed the race into success. But the story was more complicated and more complicated than we need to describe here. But some of the aspects of why it became a big deal included that the Derby was a beneficiary of the fact that racing was banned in the early 20th century in most states across the United States, and Kentucky was becoming, for complicated reasons, of an important tourist destination.
Mm.
And the Derby and Churchill Downs and Matt Wynn were beneficiaries of a complicated set of circumstances. It wasn't just that he advertised really well. The second book, Never Say Die, tells the story of the first Kentucky bred winner of the Epsom Derby, England's greatest horse race. And that colt was born on my grandfather's farm, or uh, land he leased before he started the farm where I grew up. And the colt's name was a reference to a difficult birth, and which included a drink of whiskey for the foal when he was groggy and having a hard time standing. There's also a fun connection between Never Say Die's win in the Epsom Derby and the early history of famous rock and roll band the Beatles. You can Google that. It's a long story, but it's fun. So that book weaves a number of threads together to explain how this Kentucky-born Colts win in England helped to transform international thoroughbred racing and breeding at a time when English racehorses were still widely considered to be far superior to American breds. And then the Notorious John Morrissey started as I was I was hoping to try to explain the history and the allure of the racetrack. Dates at Saratoga Springs, New York, which dates back to the 1860s. And quickly it became apparent that the story of much of the allure of Saratoga is tied to this character, John Morrissey. He had come to the United States as a child from Ireland in the mid 1800s, and he became American champion heavyweight boxer and gangster and a professional gambler, casino operator, and then a congressman. And he founded the racetrack at Saratoga as a way to increase business for his casino there. And he lived a remarkable life, but his contributions to the sport of horse racing had largely been forgotten, in part because uh, racing's leadership didn't want to play up the tie that the sport had in some cases to the criminal underworld, as I mentioned before, because of efforts to ban gambling and ban racing. So he had for a long time kind of been lost to history.
Yeah, and what I love about all of this is like this must have been fascinating to dig into and bring the subject to life, but also you're telling history that sometimes is forgotten or washed over because people don't want the associations, which happens a lot. In that this is what authors do it with when they're interested in a topic and they do a deep dive in their research, they bring the truth back to the surface. And your contribution to racing in telling the history the way it really was, rather than how people want it to be. And I imagine I want to ask this question too. In telling these stories, I'm sure there's this saying, right, that history repeats itself. Do you see lessons in these stories as you're researching them that can be applicable to today's world?
Probably, and definitely when you're researching, depending on the time that you're living in and the context that you're looking at horse racing from the past, certain things look different in 2020 than they might have in 2010 or 2000. And you're looking for accuracy, you're looking to tell the whole story, but you're also looking for things that you find interesting, that it's reasonable to assume that others will. And
Mhm.
for example, it's the same in politics or in society or anywhere else, but in horse racing, when you're researching at a time when there are voices in opposition to horse racing, it's fairly easy to gravitate toward stories from the past that might give us some better insight into how those reform movements work. And I think it probably is instructive for people who would think, well, they could never do anything to horse racing. It's been around forever. It'll continue to be around forever. Well, it very nearly wasn't 100 years ago. Winds happen to change one direction or another. It could happen again.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why these stories of the past are so important, because there's parallels to our future. So, thank you for bringing those things to life. Now, your newest book is Racing for America: The Horse Race of the Century and the Redemption of a Sport. This one sounds really good. So, tell us about this newest book.
Well, this book tells the story of a 1923 intercontinental showdown at Belmont Park in New York City between the winners of the Kentucky Derby and Epsom Derby that year. The American horse was Zev. The British horse was Papyrus. And it was the first time that two such high-profile horses had represented the United States and Great Britain in a match race. And so the book looks at the lives and careers of the major players involved in this much hyped event, both human and equine. It was dubbed by the sports writers, journalists as the race of the century at a time when sports writing was really coming to its own, and you had coverage in newspapers across the country of this race. And one of the characters was Zev's owner, Harry Sinclair. He was an oil tycoon
Mhm.
who was being investigated by Congress for his role in the notorious Teapot Dome oil scandals. But despite Sinclair's personal troubles, which were largely kept out of the sports pages, the race, the Zev Papyrus match, and the attention that it received really helped the sport to get some national positive exposure at a time when it was just a few years in the past that state after state was banning the sport, and it helped pave the way for its preservation and eventually its growth.
Wow. And this is all during the Roaring 20s. That must have been fascinating to dive into. I mean, I love how all the topics that you've chosen to cover involve like oil tycoons, the Roaring 20s, the underdogs, kind of like the underworld parts of things, and even the horse born on your grandfather's land, how he shot to life from a shot of whiskey. I mean, these are all like super interesting stories. It just, how do you do your research? How do you dive into that and grab the time? Because what I love about these books is they yes, they're nonfiction, but they read like stories. These are things that you don't think like exist in the world, and then you're telling the story of something that's real, but it reads like a story. So how do you dive in there and do your research and get the facts straight?
Well, it starts with picking a good topic,
Mm,
and I love horse racing, but to me the most fascinating parts often are the stories behind the horse races, and every horse has a jockey and a trainer and an owner and a groom and a farm where it was born and raised, and so there are countless different angles to explain what this horse race meant to the people who were experiencing it, both on the inside and the fans and gamblers
mhm.
on the outside. So, but how I research the books, it depends on the subject, but nearly all of them have started with many hours in the Keeneland Library in Lexington, Kentucky, which is home to a massive collection, trade publications, and institutional records, and I certainly try to use as many secondary sources for historical context as well.
I'm wondering, is there anyone still alive that you are actually able to talk to and interview for your books, or family members of the people? Do you ever do phoners with these people or meet them in person for coffee or something?
I haven't, but depending on if I were writing about something more recent, I
Mm.
certainly would. Um, and I could have people ask me that a lot with the Derby book. They say, "Oh, did you talk to Bob Baffert? Did you talk to Mike Smith, jockey, eh, or Chris McCarron, or any of these people?" And for example, for that project, I really didn't, because I was interested in how the United States, America more broadly, experienced the Derby rather than a blow by blow of all 100 and whatever runnings. I wanted to see what was attractive about it, why people who wouldn't watch another horse race all year would tune in by the millions on the first Saturday in May. What was the Kentucky Derby to them? And you start with the answer. Well, it's it's the fanfare and the hoopla
Mm.
and the hats and the mint juleps and the song, and then you move down this. So what is that? Why is that attractive? So in in that situation, I didn't, not that I wouldn't be interested in talking to people who participated in it, but that wasn't the perspective I wanted. I wanted a different one that I could get from, say, what the sports writers were writing about it. So here we are at the Kentucky Derby, and you see how their descriptions changed over time, what they thought their readers would want to know, and a lot of times the race itself was nearly secondary to describing the lovely women or the drunks in the infield, or whatever.
The
Uh,
guys running across the porta johns.
right? Yeah.
No, I mean, but that is fascinating. Yeah, because that's an entire different perspective than the people that are in it and training the horses. I mean, what was going on culturally in the United States? I mean, it's still a race that people who don't participate in horse racing all year tune into watch. So that's like the beginning of marketing or the beginning of branding, like how these people talked about this race and brought people together. I mean, that's a fascinating exploration. I can only imagine that people are going to jump all over this and want to learn more, because you're telling like how they built the race, not, the people that were bringing their horses to it, but like how, culturally what was going on around to make this thing such a premier event. That's so cool.
It was a lot of fun to think about. It took a good portion of my brain space for a long time.
I'm sure, but you're like, like you dove deep into, why people really were attracted to this race. And it's still one of the most attractive races that's out there. So what a fascinating journey that must have been writing that book. Now, has anything really surprising turned up for you as you've been doing your research on these different topics? I mean, we can talk about something surprising from your newest book or even one of your other books. I mean, the Beatles connection is kind of fascinating, but we don't want to give that away. We want people to read your book. But like, has anything come up that you were like, whoa, that like really surprised you?
The Beatles connection was definitely tops of the list, but with the most recent book, it was surprising, maybe not shocking, but it was a useful reminder to see the extent to which Zev, the Kentucky Derby winner who ran against England's top 3-year-old in this race of the century, how big of a deal he was in American culture at the time. He was a legitimate celebrity athlete on the same level as a Babe Ruth at the time, a real a big name, a household name. And it was interesting to dive into the newspapers that were covering the race and talking about the American hero Zev, how quickly the country and the culture just forgot about him. And I think part of it was that his owner was a shade unsavory, and he just didn't quite meet the mold that the nation needed him to. So it's a reminder that things that are of central importance today may or may not be that way, or may not be part of what people remember about this moment in history. And that was certainly true of Zev. And it's a reminder how we use our celebrities, our heroes, our athletes. We use them when they're convenient, when they fit a narrative, when they can say, see, we're hooray for the American horse, let's beat those British. When the story fits that mold, it's journalists and fans will run with it. And when it doesn't quite so neatly fit, they forget about them.
Kind of put it to the background. I'm so glad you said that. I mean, that is very relevant. And I think a lot of things being written now are bringing some of the stories that have sort of been written out of history back into the fold. And that's a great reminder. It's something to remember. Like when it fits us, we speak to it and we follow it. But when it doesn't fit, the narrative changes, and we have to be conscious that does happen. Humans do that. That's a really great point. I always like to ask, like, you live in bluegrass country, you're around racehorses all the time. You've researched the Kentucky Derby, the thoroughbred racing industry. Only 13 horses have won all 3 races in the Triple Crown. What do you think? What are your thoughts on what it takes, what kind of caliber of horse it takes to be able to win all 3 of these races?
Well, if there were one magic formula, you would have more Triple Crown winners. You'd have more people breeding for those traits. But it's when you're thinking about the Triple Crown, it's useful to remember that it's kind of an anomaly in American racing, and that it's the only time that most of these horses are going to be asked to run as far as 1.5 miles. It's certainly the only time that they'll be asked to run that far in such a short amount of time between races. It takes a special horse to win the Derby at 1.25 miles, and then the Preakness 2 weeks later at 1 mile 3/16, and then the Belmont 3 weeks after that at 1.5 miles. So to win any of those races, let alone all 3, A horse is going to need speed and stamina, but it also needs precociousness to be ready to begin training, usually as a 2-year-old, to get a foundation of fitness by the end of its 2-year-old year. It needs soundness to be able to withstand training in the Triple Crown trail, and they need athleticism to be able to get out of the gate well, to be able to avoid traffic trouble, to be able to find the right spot, the good ground, the best running room, and if you don't have that, you have one bad race, one bad trip, and you don't get a second shot at the Triple Crown. It's only for 3-year-olds. So all of that, and then luck, regular racing luck, and also probably the luck to be born in a year where there's no other super horses.
And I think you just nailed it on the head right there. Super horse. I mean, essentially is, only 13 have ever done this. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit with you about writing and marketing. Your book is traditionally published through the University Press of Kentucky. What is it like working with them? And you shared something really interesting with me. This is an academic publisher, so there's like a bit of a process to this that I wasn't aware of. So I think the listeners will be really interested to hear about what it's like working with them.
It's been great for me. As I said, every author's needs are different, and what they want to accomplish with their writing or with their book is different. So I can't say that this is the right fit for everybody, but it's definitely been great for me. And an academic publisher like University Press of Kentucky is similar to other traditional publishers in that they'll take some things off an author's plate, production and cover design, and hiring a copy editor, providing early suggestions for improvement, marketing assistance, and they produce a really nice finished product.
And I think you've got one right back there over your shoulder, your newest book.
This is the newest one. I'm kind of flipped there, but
it's beautiful.
It looks nice.
Yeah.
But a difference between other traditional publishers and an academic publisher, among other things, but a primary difference is that academic presses tend to require a process of peer review. You'll talk to an acquisitions editor and say, I have an idea for a book, or I have a finished manuscript. Would you take a look? And they'll say, well, that sounds like a good idea. Let's once you work up a proposal, here's what that needs to look like. Or they read all or a portion of the manuscript and say, yeah, this looks like this would fit our needs or our strengths. Let's send it out for peer review. And what that means is that they will find usually 2 to 3 readers, reviewers who have expertise in your field, and at least for nonfiction and history, the realm I know anything about. They'll send it to people, usually people who have published books before, but definitely have some experience or expertise in the field, and they will give feedback, which is useful, very useful if you're willing to take it. If you say, what's this clown know? Then not very useful. But they'll say either they recommend for publication, they don't recommend, or they recommend for publication, provided that the author makes certain changes. And so that's intimidating and an obstacle that some people would say, I don't need to worry about that. It's necessary for people who work in academia, for people whose jobs or promotions depend on having published something that's been through the peer review process. But plenty of people publish this way and aren't in that realm. But if you're not in that realm, it might not be uh, as attractive, but it it's, it shouldn't scare off anybody either. I think it's a it's it's a useful tool when you allow it to be.
Yeah, and well, that's another form of maybe advanced feedback. So a lot of independent authors that I speak with, we use what we call beta readers or advanced readers, where we send, to our uh, trusted early readers, we send early copies, and they provide feedback or they catch things. But in academia, it's peer review is a big thing. It's like in publishing is a big deal, like publishing papers and books
Hmm.
and what have you. With peer review or early beta reader review, the feedback kind of stays with you and gives you the opportunity to improve your manuscript. So I think it's useful. It's interesting that it's kind of built into your process of getting the book across the finish line with your publisher, which is, I think, really fascinating. And then tell us about the Horses in History series. You're the editor for it.
It's funny looking back on it because I I suppose it got it had its beginnings when I was looking for a publisher for my first book about the Derby, and I think we were already fairly well down the road, but uh, thinking back on it, I wonder why I was so confident, bold to be the wrong word, but I said, you all, thank you for agreeing to publish this, looking forward to it, but what about other equine topics? There really isn't anybody doing a whole lot of it. Why aren't you all doing more? And well, we would. We just don't have any projects. And the an acquisitions editor that I was working with there ended up. I think she took that seat, or for all I know, she already had that seat, and this was just a confirmation that it was a good idea. But she and I worked up a proposal for a series, and the vision was, I think we're moving toward that, was to not be limited to racehorses, but to include everything from polo ponies in ancient China to mules to war horses
Mm.
to anything dealing with the relationship between people and horses at any time. We started with some equine biographies, and we're moving forward with a couple of projects that I think are going to broaden the scope of the series. But it's a lot of fun for me and very rewarding to see these projects go from idea to fruition. It's a similar satisfaction to having written a book myself, but a lot easier for me.
Well, editing, I don't know, editing can, I'm sure, is not an easy task, like being behind the scenes and making books better. But I love this concept. I love that it's inclusive of all horses in history and their stories. And I think it's a brilliant idea. And isn't that funny how that little magical thing happens when, like a seed starts and then all of a sudden, wow, look at what's happening. I mean, because I've had, let's see, Jennifer S. Kelly, Peter Lee, Milton Toby on the show. He's great. I mean, now you, and there's many more out there that, are telling these stories. And I think it's fascinating that you're embracing it, the publisher's embracing it, and there's just more coming. I mean, this is limitless, this series. And there's avid readers out there who love history and horses. And there's people who just like to read history, but then there's people who like to just read about horses. So you've got like two solid demographics that you can pitch these books to.
Well, that was our hope and our belief, and so far everything that's gone through the pipeline has worked, has been good and been well received.
I'd like to ask this question too, because I mean, look at all you've done. What do you wish you'd known when you started out on this journey of being an author of books?
I probably wish that I'd understood the importance of reading as much as I could. And I was always I liked books and liked reading, but I didn't learn till later on the significance of being an active reader and participating in a community of readers and or writers, and understanding that the reader is the other side of the same coin of writing, and that
Mm.
without both, you don't have a book that comes to life. You just have words on a page on a shelf. So I would tell my younger self to take reading more seriously, to find writers that you enjoy, and to see how they work, how they use language to communicate, how they organize, structure their books, what makes their story enjoyable and followable. And I would probably tell my younger self that be sure that you understand the significance of editing. I think it's
Mm.
easy to assume that authors type away and they finish the last sentence and have the last period and send it off, and it's a book, and I've I've come to appreciate more and more every year that good writing is much more about good editing and repetition of editing, and going through a manuscript time and time and time and time again to be able to take an adequate book and make it a good book, to take a good book to make it a great book. It's not just the words that pop off the top of your head. This is you want to make the words sound good together. You want to make the pieces fit. You want the reader to not see the sweat and the eraser marks. And that's probably what I wish I knew better. But I'm learning as I go.
Yeah, and I love that you said that. Those are two great pieces of advice. I mean, no book. I think you said when the last period is punched on the keyboard, that's when the real work begins. Like, and no, every book is there's a team around a good book that helps it be successful. The author brings the story and the words, and the editors improve it, and then they'll whole their team of everybody else that does whatever they do around it to make this thing exist. But I loved how you said that you would tell your younger self to be a more active reader. Isn't it funny how after you've started writing a book, you start reading differently? Like I read differently now that I've written my first book, and I've improved as a writer because I'm reading differently. I'm more active. I'm engaged. I'm looking at structure and plot and the way they're using punctuation and word choice, and it's like before it was just like a movie in my mind, blow through the page, but now I'm like actually really looking and really reading. It's like I'm using my brain in a different way. And I think that's what you're alluding to. Is that sort of your experience as well?
It is, and it's. I'd imagine I've never done anything with film, for example, but I would imagine it's difficult for somebody who's directed a movie or worked on a movie set to be able to watch a movie like I do, which is just to enjoy the story. They're looking at cuts and camera angles and
Hmm.
lighting and all that stuff, and I find myself, yeah, doing something similar when reading a book now, which it is a different experience, but I don't think it spoils the story. I still enjoy reading and enjoy the story, but I'm kind of doing two
Yeah.
things at once, learning, kind of trying to look beneath the behind the curtain, and see how the wheels are moving, but you can do that and still enjoy the surface of the story, I think.
Totally agree. Yeah. I still enjoy a book as much as I always enjoyed a book. I just, it's like it's a little bit more, I guess, in depth. And the
Mhm.
analogy of the filmmaker watching a film, it's exactly like that. I that was a great analogy. So I always like to ask these questions of authors that come on the show because sometimes the answers are similar, but sometimes they're different. But there's always a little glimmer of insight inside of them. So in your experience, what has been the hardest part about being an author? And then on the flip side of that, what has been the very best part of being an author for you?
But for me, it's got to be when somebody tells me they got something out of something I've written, or that
Mhm.
they enjoyed it, especially when it's not a friend or a family member, it's somebody who I didn't know before. It's really nice to, and kind of can keep me plowing ahead when I'm not sure if I'm gonna be able to have a story that's gonna work. It's nice to remember the idea that maybe somebody's understanding of some small corner of the world was broadened or deepened just a touch by something that I've written. And superficially, it's nice to have a finished product and put it on the bookshelf like a participation trophy or just a little tangible reminder of the time and effort that went into making.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's nothing like holding a book for the very first time or hearing someone you don't know say, "Man, I loved what you had to say in that book." I mean, just the idea that we created something that never existed before or told a story in a different way is just really powerful. We have to remind ourselves of that, I think, sometimes as authors, because we can get really hard on ourselves. And I guess that's one of the difficult things, right? Is probably the author mindset, it's like, how do I write this book?
Why bother her? Why,
Yeah, why am I doing this
this
to
is
myself?
hard, and there's other things I could be doing with my time.
Yeah, I could go eat a hamburger with my family rather than trying to make this monster work. But in the end, it's very rewarding. And then that leads me into this next question. I love that you teach history and you've written these books. Like, is there one common myth about writing a book that you'd love to knock off its rocker or debunk?
I suspect that thanks to resources like this podcast, like other websites and blogs and how-to books, I would imagine that there are far fewer myths out there for people who are looking to learn about the book world than there were just a few years ago. At least I hope that's the case. Big picture, I would say that maybe it's not quite as hard as some people would think it is. I hear a lot of people say, "Well, I can never write a book. How do you do that? Crank out hundreds of pages? That's impossible." And it's not easy, but it maybe not for the reasons that people might think. It's because everybody's written a couple pages or maybe a longer paper at some point in school, and so a book's less a continuous hundreds of pages of words than it is a string, a collection of shorter sections. So that part's not that hard. I mean, the challenge is having an idea or a story that's going to keep a reader's attention for more than a couple minutes. We talked about the significance of editing before, but I think it's worth repeating that it's just that's where really the last word, the last period is really where, to me, good writing begins and really is the difference between something that a reader is going to be able to read and enjoy and just a collection of words on a page. And it's a fine distinction, but it's a really important one.
So how do you approach writing your books and finding the structure to tell that story that people will want to read? Because clearly you've done that several times here.
It is daunting to start writing a book, at least for me. But I try to smooth over that hurdle by before I start writing. I've been working largely in my mind, but eventually on paper, on a loose outline, a loose idea for a structure, and I'll keep working on that and editing that throughout the whole process. And before I start writing, I'll eventually have some pretty good notes that fit the various pieces, so that I don't have to, so I can fairly smoothly say, okay, I think I have a general idea of what I'm trying to say and how I'm trying to say it, and then I can start writing. It's like I've gotten a bit of a running start. If I just had to sit down and say, okay, in the beginning, I might not be able to start.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's like laying out a template for where you want to go, like where you want to go, chapter by chapter and how it's going to end. And I imagine with research, an outline is even more vital. I mean, it's important in fiction too, but I can imagine it's even more vital because you're working with dates and timelines and events, and you need to kind of plug those in so the story can take shape. So an outline is a great way to start, and then you're not right facing what 80,000 words without a guidepost.
Yeah, and for me, it depends on your topic, and particularly history and academic history. Some people are writing more or to provide a set of information,
Mhm.
but with what I am drawn to and the kind of stories I want to tell, I, I want to sneak in the information. It's valid. It's documented. I'm not making anything up, but I also want to make sure that it works not just as a piece of history, but also as a story that can be read. And that's the challenge. That's maybe a bigger challenge. I can find something that's interesting and say, hey, I bet you didn't know about this. Here's what happened.
Mhm.
Uh, but if the story doesn't have a beginning, a middle, and end of something that resembles a traditional narrative arc, then I don't really want to read it, or I probably won't enjoy it. And I want my books to be read by somebody, not just. I mean, there are some historians you just need to know that people are aware of their book and can find it in the research library once every 10 years when somebody has a need. I'd rather people read and enjoy the book. So that's that's another thing that the a little bit of organization and an outline allows me to convince myself that this is going to work, that I can get to the finish line and have the story in one piece.
Yeah, I mean, that is an art, to tell a story with true characters from history, and that does make it so much more enjoyable for readers. Yes, this happened, but let me story tell it to you, So I can only imagine uh, that is a challenge and a worthy one when you finish and people are saying, I loved what I learned from the story you told about this real thing that happened in history. That's got to feel so good. So
Absolutely.
you deep dive into history. You choose interesting stories to tell. You've been focused on some of the biggest races in U.S. The Kentucky Derby, obviously. You have a lot of knowledge. You grew up there. What are you curious about? Like, what's next? Where are you heading? Like, you've got this new book out now. Do you have another project in the background or something you're thinking on?
Sort of. I have a topic that is intriguing and that I've started digging into and that I've compiled a bunch of notes for, but we're going to see. It hasn't quite come together yet. There was a horse in the early 20th century who won the Kentucky Derby by a record margin uh, in record time. Looked like he was going to be a superstar, and he strained a tendon in his next race and was out of training for 2.5 years. He spent much of that time turned out with cattle on a ranch in Texas. That piece is pretty fascinating, or potentially fascinating enough to center a story on. So hopefully it'll click. Or I don't know if I don't know. I assume this is. I'm not the only one who thinks like this, but it might not be universal for writers. I'm. It's always possible when I've. So far, I've always, as I've finished one book, I had the idea for the next one, and that was true of this one. But I'm always aware of the possibility that it might just dry up, and this might be it. It hadn't happened so far, so it probably won't. But so yes and no to your question of do I have another one in mind?
That's a really cool answer. I was speaking with another author, Rennie Dyball. She actually worked for People magazine, and she said something similar that you said. You know, it's like next projects. You know, sometimes not so sure. Is this going to dry up? And she said she's been practicing being comfortable with the times where the muse like needs a rest and things don't feel like they're clicking, because she says like involuntarily things are still kind of moving around in the back of your mind and you're getting organized. So you kind of have an idea, you know, but that lightning bolt usually comes when you just allow yourself the space to be like, I can breathe. The muse is going to come back. It just needs a little bit of a break. And I thought that was really interesting insight too, because I think all authors feel that way. You know, you finish a project and then you're like, oh my gosh, am I able to do this again? Do I have another idea? But I think, you know, if you're a creative, you're always a creative, and things kind of bubble back up when the time is right. You know, it's like the universe says, let's rest for a second. And then all of a sudden you're jumping out of bed in the middle of the night or coming out of the shower and you're writing, you know, 16 pages of notes and you're like, that's it. Does that resonate?
I think so. Yeah, that sounds like perfect advice. I think just have to keep yourself open to the possibility for inspiration, or that I mean the pieces will click, and if there's always things rattling around up there in the old noggin, and eventually they'll settle in a shape that makes sense to move forward. So yeah, that's
Yeah.
good advice.
I know, it makes you feel better. Be like, okay, I can breathe, I can rest. It'll come. Just got to give it a little space. You know, that was great advice. Like when she said that, I was like, oh my gosh, I'm going to sit with that. Uh, you know, and my final question: is there anything a reader would be surprised to learn about you? We kind of tickled music a little bit at the beginning, and I think we're going to kind of circle back to that a little bit.
Yeah, I was trying to think of what what would be what would be interesting. I don't know what would be surprising, but when I was younger, in my 20s, I played in a band, played bass with some friends from high school that had all come back to Lexington. Not good enough to devote our lives to it, but good enough to get on some bills and some stages opening for some fun artists. If anybody's a fan of alt country Americana music, they might know some of these names. But we were fans of some of these guys like the Avett Brothers, and Sturgill Simpson, James McMurtry, and Alejandro Escovedo, and really had a lot of fun with it. We still play every now and then here and there, but it's gotten more challenging with kids and jobs and all that.
But how cool. I mean, thank you for sharing that with us. I mean, just if you think on it, like you're a groom in Ireland, you know, you wrote these books, you're a professor, you play bass opening for some really awesome Americana bands. Like that's a cool life. You know, now you have a family, but you know, you still mess around with the creative pursuits, and I think that's all we can ask for, right? So like thank you for, you know, sharing that with us. I think that was a neat little tidbit. And Jamie, I have loved speaking with you today and having you on the show. You know, I'm excited to see where the Horses in History series goes. I think it's limitless, and I'm excited that it's, you know, you're on this project and you're the editor and you're finding great stories for us horse lovers and history buffs to read. Can you let listeners know where they can find you and your books online?
Well, any day now, you might be able to find me on a website that we've been working on, which will be in coming weeks, jamescnicholson.com, or I'm on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. You can ask for my books at your local bookstore. They can order them if they don't have them, and you can support your local store, or online at University Press at Kentucky website, which is kentuckypress.com, or Amazon, or bookshop.org, or wherever you like to buy books.
I love that you mentioned support our local bookstores. Let's definitely support our local bookstores and the presses that are putting these books out, the authors we want these places to exist and live and breathe for us. So I'm glad you mentioned that. And I will make sure to link to all the places where you can reach Jamie in the show notes. And, Jamie, I wish you so much success. Thank you for opening up and sharing your process and your experiences with us.
Well, thank you, Carly. Thanks for having me on. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Equestrian Author Spotlight podcast. I hope you enjoy these Q&A sessions with wonderful equine authors who love all things horses and riding, just like me. Visit my website, carlycadecreative.com, where you can read the show notes, and make sure you never miss a show by clicking the subscribe button now. This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. Thank you so much for your support. Want a free guide to secrets of horsebook authors? Gallop over to carlycadecreative.com/wisdom to have author advice delivered instantly to your inbox. If you are an author who writes about horses and would like to be spotlighted, please let me know. Visit my contact page at carlycadecreative.com to fill out a request. I'd be happy to have you on the show too. Thank you for tuning in to the Equestrian Author Spotlight podcast. See you next time. I'm your host, Carly Cade. Creative writing makes my spurs jingle.